It's been said that strange behavior occurs with every rising of a full moon, but as we approach the year 2000, that strange behavior may be even more on the rise. Please stay with us as Austin Faith Dialogue takes a look at cults.
Austin Faith Dialogue, at the crossroads of religion and life. A series highlighting the cultural and social interactions between the worshiping and religious communities in and around the capital city. Austin Faith Dialogue is brought to you by the Austin Metropolitan Ministries in cooperation with KXAN. Join us now in Austin Faith Dialogue.
Hello, my name is Shane Whistler, your host for this edition of Austin Faith Dialogue. We're very glad you've joined us today. And with us in the studio to help us have a discussion about cults is Robert Draper, Senior Editor of Texas Monthly, and Professor Edward Shirley of St. Edward's University, Professor of Religious Studies. And could you two tell us, Robert, how long have you been in the writing and publishing business? And
this is my 7th year with Texas Monthly. Prior to that, I was a freelance journalist for another 6 or 7 years.
Okay. And Ed, how did you become to be a professor?
I studied hard. Now, I've been a professor at St. Edward's. I've been teaching at St. Edward's for 12 years now. I had a feeling I just wanted to move in a more intellectual realm of dealing with the faith, and teaching at a university seemed to be the way.
Yeah. Thank you. Well, we're glad you're here. Thank you for giving your time to help us. Nothing definitive today, but it's helpful as we approach the year 2000. We expect some cults literally have a timetable set based on the calendar, and it's not even the turn of the century, but just the year 2000, 2001 begins the new century. But we will expect things to be happening, and you've been looking into that, Robert, with the article that was recently in Texas Monthly. And I think it will wake everyone up to take a look at the cover of the Texas Monthly magazine that was just recently published. And keep in mind that this is simply the voice of one cult and a person that Robert interviewed. So that's not an endorsement of this program or any others, but that's the level of shocking statements that we're dealing with. So Robert, you've had the rare experience of being inside and talking to these folks that call themselves the House of Yahweh.
That's correct, they do. The House of Yahweh is a religious organization. One could call them a cult. Many do call them a cult, that exists or is headquartered a few miles outside of the city of Abilene in West Texas. They have been in existence since 1980. It's difficult to put a number on the congregation. There seem to be a good 500 or so members, perhaps more, in and around Abilene, but the congregation extends well beyond there. The House of Yahweh itself claims that there are perhaps 10,000 members. I would suggest maybe more, like a couple thousand, but still it's a formidable organization. Now, it is a cult perhaps insofar as its religious tenets amount to kind of a mishmash of a variety of other religious faiths. In addition to that, it is a somewhat sequestered organization, though people do live throughout America and throughout the environs of West Texas. It is centered in what I called a headquarters, but which in fact more closely resembles a compound that has security guards, and a compound that also houses its spiritual leader, a man who goes by the name Israel Hawkins. Often one sees in cults a cult leader, and Hawkins certainly qualifies. He was a former police officer of the Abilene Police Department. Prior to that, he was a rockabilly musician. But somewhere along the line, so he says, got religion and formed his religious organization in 1980, changed his name in 1982 from what had been his given name, which, believe it or not, was Buffalo Bill Hawkins, to Israel Hawkins, and thereafter announced that it had been prophesied that he would be one of the 2 witnesses chosen by Yahweh, that holiest of appellations for the Creator, to gather those of similar religion to prepare for the end of the world.
Mm-hmm. I think we also want to add that that's a name they've chosen, and to respect our friends in Jewish communities, that name, first of all, we don't know how that would be pronounced, and is not used. It's other words for describing God are substituted for that name. But they've chosen this. They're not Jewish. They're not Christian.
No, no.
They're their own fabrication.
That's right. Though their religion relies on many of the Old Testament tenets one finds in Judaism, they have the kind of apocalyptic predisposition that one finds in a lot of so-called doomsday cults. There are certain similarities, but I should emphasize only certain ones, to Seventh-day Adventism and to the Jehovah's Witness religion. Probably the best way to distill down their belief system is that they believe that one can enter the kingdom of heaven, one can achieve that holiest of realms only through following very closely not merely the 10 Commandments, but the 613 rabbinic laws of Yahweh that are found throughout the first sections of the Old Testament, and in addition to prepare for what they believe will be the imminent collapse of the world. They have arrived at the year 2000 now. We've heard that before from other end-of-the-world cults. They derive their belief that the year 2000 will be the year that earth as we know it shall perish, from the belief that there was a scriptural prophecy that the Israeli peace accords orchestrated by the Pope in 1993 would pull the trigger, would signal the beginning of the 7 years of tribulation, that horrible period during which we will see plagues aplenty, after which, or culminating in, presumably by September of 2000, a nuclear holocaust which shall incinerate 4/5 of the world.
So it packs a powerful punch, and it sounds like he's very persuasive in his presentation. And you've been in the services.
I have been to the service, and in keeping with what they believe to be the religious prescription, their Sabbath is on Saturday. The service is held in a compound, though there was a sign that said anyone is welcome. In fact, they're very careful about who they let in, and there is a guard gate by which one should announce oneself to the security guard there, after which your name and your license plate number is radioed ahead to people at the sanctuary. The one that I attended on a Saturday morning had perhaps 400 members or so, and it was fairly straightforward, except that the nature of the sermon, delivered by Israel Hawkins, was one that I found to be more mean-spirited than one typically finds in any other church, in that Hawkins sees it as part and parcel of his religion to sort of boast the superiority, the authenticity of the house of Yahweh by deprecating other religions, particularly that of Christianity and particularly Catholicism. And so his sermon was rife with sneering references to the wrong-headedness of Christians, Catholics in particular, with multitudinous references to the beastly system, which is the Catholic Church in accordance with the governments of throughout the world, which would together foster ultimately a series of circumstances that would lead to the end of the world as we know it.
That's as anyone would admit who's involved deeply in churches or other religious groups, that no matter what system we have is humanly devised, there are going to be mistakes, but he has taken that and made it personified evil.
That's right. Well, his view is that Christians have been led astray, and indeed many people who have joined the house of Yahweh have done so because they have believed that religion never spoke to them before for one reason or another. It didn't make sense. Christianity being a case in point. Former Christians would say when they joined the house of Yahweh, it never made sense to me how to reconcile the New Testament with the Old. One tells you very strictly do's and don'ts. The other one says, from what they believe they had been taught, throw out the Old Testament. Instead we preach love and forgiveness. They believe that the house of Yahweh, by attending to the apocalyptic notions that one sees in the book of Revelations, while in the meantime adhering to the 613 13 laws of Yahweh amounts to a kind of synthesis of the two testaments.
I think you've touched on a primary entryway, an avenue by which people become involved and interested in cults, is that those questions, all the things that are irreconcilable about their understanding of whatever scripture we're talking about. Is that what you've seen and what you've looked at in cults, Ed?
Yeah, there's a hunger, I think, out there in general in society for some type of spiritual fulfillment, and a lot of times people are looking for answers. And usually somewhere in between the extremes of here's the black and white, here's all the answers, and it's all up for grabs, nobody has a clue. Somewhere in the middle, there are people who are seeking and proposing answers and re-looking at them, but that's a difficult process. I mean, that to ask people to go through, to say, okay, look at this and then look at these different sides. So a lot of times people seeing confusion in their lives, seeing confusion in society as a whole, tend to look for simple, straightforward answers. And so just that example of reconciling the Old and New Testament, that's something that Christians have been dealing with for a long time. In fact, reconciling some of the Jewish scriptures with their own time period has been something that Jews have struggled with over the centuries. That's the reason for the Talmud and the whole oral tradition in Judaism. But that's a process. That's a difficult process sometimes to do that balancing. And so if you have somebody come along and say, well, here's the simple answer. It's this, and boom. And so a lot of times people then saying, okay, nobody else was able to explain it this way. So they buy in.
Let me jump in also and add that or maybe more specifically to the point, many of the people I met who were members of the House of Yahweh congregation found appeal in the House of Yahweh because it told them very specifically how they should live their lives. Many people ask themselves, how can I live the holy life, the life that the Creator wants me to live? Well, according to the House of Yahweh, there is a very strict list of do's and don'ts, and that certainly simplifies one's life. Now, the trick, of course, comes in terms of does the Bible say precisely that, and was one of the more controversial features of the House of Yahweh, and we have seen this in other religions or cults before, is the manner in which they interpret. They say translate, but one might also suggest a sort of rejigger the scriptures to their liking.
Mm-hmm. It seems that what you describe, and certainly the cover, that quote on the magazine, it makes us uncomfortable, but in experiencing these sermons or the doctrines of these cult and their leaders, we call it uncomfortable, but I would imagine that makes the people that belong very comfortable because they know definitely black and white, either right or wrong, and so they're very comfortable in the midst of something that seems really tumultuous.
Well, yes. I think that people ask themselves, God put us here on earth, a creator, Yahweh, whatever appellation one chooses to use, and intends for us to live a particular way, has provided for us a religious text that we should live by. And yet the text seems contradictory at times, confusing at other times. And what does it all mean? Who will sort it out for us? Israel Hawkins has appointed himself as one who would sort it out.
They want it very simple. Many of us do, but it's not that simple, and that's something we'll come back to after this short break. Please stay with us on Austin Faith Dialogue. Thank you for staying with us. My name is Shane Whistler, your host of this edition of Austin Faith Dialogue, brought to you by Austin Metropolitan Ministries and Channel 54 KNVA. We are in the studio today with Robert Draper, Senior Editor of Texas Monthly, and Edward Shirley, Professor of Religious Studies at St. Edward's University, and talking on an enormous topic, cults. Not that we can define it, but it bears probing into as we approach the year 2000, and that seems to be, as we said, calendars are set. When the clock ticks 2000, many people are saying things are going to go terribly wrong, as if God is measuring with a watch and cares about timing on a calendar. And to me, sometimes that strikes me as a little bit arbitrary. And what do you think about that, Ed?
You know, if you study historically what went on as the year 1000 approached, the same types of things. Doomsday. They didn't have cults back then. They didn't call them cults, but sects or just movements in medieval Christianity. People thinking, okay, this was a milestone somehow, and so God must be bound by this, because of course they didn't understand the arbitrary nature of the dating to begin with. But this type of thing has happened. It happened in the year, as I say, in the year 1000. It also tends to happen at the turn of centuries, anyway. You know, so but when you have the turn of a millennium, that seems to bring it out quite a bit more. So, yeah.
So it's probably just not our imagination. There will be more and more of these events. It's just the end of each century, and especially now the millennium.
Oh no, I've seen, and you're not going to just find this with cults. You find this with some long-established religious groups who read the Bible literally, for example. And I have seen, and it's not exact dating, but I saw somebody who taking Adam and Eve very literally, said, well, the creation of the world was about in the year 4000 BC, and so you had about 2,000 years till Abraham, so that was the beginning of the Jewish nation. Then you had 2,000 years until Christ. Now you have 2,000 years of Christianity, and now, of course, the world's got to end. So, you know, it's not just cults that are doing this. You know, it's, well, it depends on how you're defining cult, but I mean, when you look at some, what many of us would consider strange behavior as the year 2000 approaches, I think you're going to see it even in some relatively mainstream groups as well. I
remember in recent years receiving postcards with in the mail, just a general blanket mailing, direct mail, promoting some educational series on the Book of Revelation, which is so often terribly misinterpreted. We're not sure if anyone can interpret with much accuracy all the symbolism and the rich language that's in there, but taking it terribly out of context and focusing on that and frightening people. So I think we would wholly endorse that we appreciate the freedom we have in this country, the freedom of faith to explore, for people to be seekers and in their own way explore Scripture as they feel led to do so, but we want to dispel some of the fear.
I think that's an important point. Whenever there is some type of catastrophe, a mass suicide at Jonestown, or 39 people, you know, with Heaven's Gate or whatever, we become very aware of cults. Suddenly, we're talking about cults everywhere, and the fact is, these groups were there all along, you know, and something just happened then. But people do get concerned with cults. I think you really have to be careful not to jump into a panic mode, as though these were people out, you know, kidnapping people, dragging them away. I mean, maybe that happens in some instances, but just be very careful, you know, because what you said about the freedom in this country, if you're not willing to cut some slack, even to organizations with whom you disagree intensely, you're treading on dangerous ground there, because, okay, if for example, we say, okay, now the house of Yahweh goes, and they're not doing anything, you know, especially illegal or whatever, but just because, you know, we consider them dangerous or whatever, if we say they go, then what happens to the Quakers, the Mormons, the Catholics, the Baptist. All of these have been persecuted groups. All of these have been persecuted groups. And do we want to open ourselves to that type of reality? I mean, thank God the United States has avoided the type of ethnic and religious bloodshed that has plagued other parts of the world. You know, and I hope we can continue. But if we get into that panic mode, we start seeing the devil everywhere. You know, and then pretty soon nobody's safe.
And Ed's point is salient with respect to the house of Yahweh. I think it's fair to say that they're not hurting anyone. They're not breaking any laws unless perhaps they're breaking laws relating to polygamy, and there's some question about that. The truth is that if there's anything dubious about many of these cults, it is the so-called cult leader, and in this case that would apply as well to the house of Yahweh insofar as the real controversies surround themselves, not so much around the congregation, those being fairly respectable, certainly spiritually earnest individuals, but instead the individual who formed the organization and who has something of a questionable past in terms of his religious convictions, in terms of his marital habits, and who has been dogged by controversy since starting the House of Yahweh in terms of what has become of the money that people have tithed him, and whether or not he has taken advantage of individuals in the congregation. All of that being said, then what we come to in the end is that perhaps members of the House of Yahweh are hurting themselves by being involved in it, but that does not a dangerous cult make. And the unfortunate circumstances we have seen in the past have been often due to violent conflicts between the government and the cult in question. Usually it's the presence of arms that make that a possibility, if not a likelihood. And in the case of the House of Yahweh, as far as anyone knows, there are there's no stockpiling of munitions going there. So we need not send up the red flares every time we see a religious organization that seems to behave in a way that we find rather odd. It does not make them dangerous.
I have to ask the question, what is it that we fear about cults? And sometimes I wonder if it's because as a society, and even as mainstream religion, are we so unused to commitment on the part of people that when we see it, it looks threatening. When we see commitment, it looks weird. You know, I like to tell the story about a young man who joined a religious group. He fit all the profiles you usually hear about people joining cults. His mother was rather cold and distant, died when he was very young. His father died when he was 15. They had just sort of hopped all over the world, never had a stable place to live, lived with a series of relatives, joined the Communist Party for a while, ended up joining a religious group where they shaved their heads, got up early in the morning and started chanting. They'd work all day. All the money they made went to the religious group. His mail was checked going in and out. And so you say, well, how could he have, he was a very intelligent man. How could he have given himself to that type of religious organization? Well, his name was Thomas Merton, and he was a Trappist monk and one of the leading Catholic intellectuals of this century. So, just to describe that way of life that he was living, many people say, oh, well, there's a cult, there's something dangerous. Maybe this is something where someone has found meaning in their life, and enough meaning that they are willing to commit themselves to it 100%. So I think that's why one reason why we have to be very cautious about just throwing around the label cult. Mm-hmm. And sure, if they're stockpiling weapons, that's a sign they might be dangerous to others. But somebody like the house or the Heaven's Gate, they baked rum cakes and designed web pages. Who knew? And also, if they're just dangerous to themselves, how much can the law really step in to protect
Only
people from
insofar as
themselves?
it has to do with children, and that is where the rubber meets the road in the eyes of the government. They believe that when children are dragged into a cult, and of course that was certainly one of the initial justifications used to come into Mount Carmel, then that bears some investigation. And it is a matter it's a matter to focus on to some degree, but again, I think that there's a tendency on the part of some who, often the government and otherwise others who view with suspicion these groups to focus immediately on the children, see if the children are not being educated in a way that we would typically educate them, and use that as a means to drive a wedge into them. That being said, it's worth noting that as even former members of the House of Yahweh told me, these kids could have been dealing crack, they could have been buying weapons. Instead, they were being taught religion in a little compound. It's not so bad.
I think we've already covered, just in the nature of our conversation, that we're not out to condemn, and even this conversation, individuals, people searching for some spiritual direction or meaning, but certainly sometimes cults are dangerous, but we need to be careful about where we put that label. I was wondering, though, if there are, I think sometimes people are just shocked by who winds up in a cult, and it could be just literally anyone. I know several people in Texas know of Herb Applewhite, who was the leader of the Heaven's Gate cult. I know a woman in my own congregation, he used to be a choir director in the Houston area. Their family, when he was a younger man, struggling, they loaned him their car for a while with no question, just wanted to help him out. He was just a talented man. His father was a minister. So that was just shocking to find out who is involved. But are there a couple of concerns or any red flags that you would like to point out if someone is worried that maybe their child or disenfranchised relative could fall prey to a cult, or at least a community that may not be very healthy?
I'd say, first of all, when you're dealing with teenagers, okay, and even into the early 20s, you're dealing with people who are undergoing their own questioning and a little bit of antisocial behavior, and so they're breaking away anyway, and that's natural. Okay, so how to distinguish that between that and, okay, they've joined a religious group, and that seems to be part of their process right now, their journey. Okay, how dangerous is this, and how much is it just part of adolescent exploring or just human exploring? But I think that if a group encourages people to cut off all ties with family, if it has an us and them mentality, particularly when combined with some type of apocalyptic vision, so you've got the good guys who are in here and the bad guy, everybody's the bad guy out there, that might be something to be concerned about, but I think the main question is, how easy is it to leave this particular group? I mean, not just would they encourage you to stay, but...
Okay. I think those are good things to watch out for, and I appreciate you two being with us, and especially we hope we've added some enlightenment to you in this good discussion we've had about cults on Austin Faith Dialogue. My name is Shane Whistler. Until next time, peace be with you.